Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Nicholas Mosvik, and I am the Buckley Legacy Project the Buckley Legacy Project Manager at the National Review Institute. And we are going to have a conversation here today with three of our young members here at National Review on Bill Buckley's 100th birthday, to really think about how Bill is still an enduring and relevant figure in American conservatism. Now, I would like to leave as much time as possible for our three young people here, um, I'm sorry, I said it wrong, Haley, Kamden, and Guy, to discuss. So let me just introduce them very quickly. Haley Strack is a staff writer here at National Review, and Kamden, Mulder, and Guy Denton are both William F. Buckley Fellows in Political Journalism at National Review Institute. With that, I'd like to allow you guys to get started. If we have any particular questions, please send them in. About 40 minutes in or so to this conversation, we'll start doing Q&A. So if you have questions, send them into the chat. And if you have any specific questions about Bill's history, especially with young people, please think constructively about that. With that, Haley, go ahead and get started.
Thank you, Nicholas, and thank you all so much for being on this call on what would have been Bill's 100th birthday. Like all of you, many of us have read the magazine for years throughout our childhood, and we all feel a deep affinity to Bill and his magazine, even though we never knew the guy, we never met him, but he still obviously lives on with us through his amazing words that you all still read. So on this 100th birthday, we just thought it'd be fun to explain why we as young people see National Review still as the flagship magazine for conservative opinion and news, why we chose to start our careers at National Review and hopefully end them someday at National Review. So the title of this is Buckley's Greatest Hits, because as you know, Buckley wrote so many essays, so many books, and we each have a different specific, maybe Buckley essay or quote or video that attracted us to National Review's mission. So I'm going to let Kamden and Guy explain to them sort of some of their favorite Buckley essays, or maybe some essays that are a little lesser known. So Kamden, we're going to start with you, but you go ahead.
Awesome. So thank you, Haley, first of all. So the essay I chose to speak about today was from 1970, and it was titled Women's Lib, and it was essentially just a criticism of the women's liberation movement and second wave feminism. And the reason I chose that today is because it is just still such a prevalent conversation, and it's a conversation that has continued to evolve as we've seen the emergence of transgenderism, men and female spaces, all of those things. And so to start off, I just have a little excerpt that I thought I'd read and then discuss it. So it starts, the ladies are busy writing books like The Feminine Mystique and Sexual Politics, and there is much that is engrossing and brilliant in these books. But inevitably, the taxonomical ambition to make men and women equal breaks down under the unassailable insight that at McSorley's, things are different when women are admitted. Context for that, earlier in the piece, Buckley describes that there is a pub in New York, it's called McSorley's, and they recently allowed women to come in and be patrons at the pub. So Buckley continues, it is, needless to say, the same, stated the other way around. Things would be different at New York's Colony Club if men were admitted. Really, one oughtn't to have to go any further than that. Those who believe that all one's emotions and instincts and preferences can be nicely situated and explained away do not know the virtues of a limited curiosity. For one thing, as Wyndham Lewis pointed out, if you succeed in exactly categorizing everyone, you rob everyone of his freedoms. And so that little excerpt that I just read, the last line really stood out to me, especially just as I said with what's going on today and trying to, convince people that transgender men can be in women's locker rooms, they can be in women's sports, all those things. And Buckley just had, a really great take on the whole issue that men and women are different. We were created different. And there was a reason for that. And it's actually really like beautiful and amazing that men and women are different. And that's obviously been, a pillar in America for a very long time and a conversation in America for a long time. And while, we can all agree that certain parts of feminism, like women being able to vote, is great, and Buckley would have agreed with that too. It gets to the point where it can go too far, and he continues to further discuss how that Congress is about to uh, pass an amendment to, make sexual discrimination illegal. And he basically says too, he's like, when you do things like that, you ultimately also lose freedoms because you're ignoring those differences by trying to make everyone equal. And so, yeah, I just wanted to talk about that today because I felt like it was so prevalent in what's going on, and it's an ever evolving conversation. And as you said, Haley, it just really speaks to the point why Buckley's virtues and beliefs are just so enduring in America today.
Yeah, for sure. And the excesses of women's lib, and especially things like third wave feminism, are things that Buckley definitely carries on into this day. I mean, I don't know if anyone is online as much as maybe Kamden Guy or I, but if you're here at the National Review panel, I imagine you probably are. But there's been a lot of discourse lately about conservative women and especially how much truth they are allowed access to. Essentially, one of the things that's been going on online is women having a big debate over how harmful porn can be to men. It's something that plagues Gen Z, especially. Like young men are addicted to porn. Young women are too. I'm not exempting young women from this either. But again, like the way Buckley so beautifully explained the differences between the sexes and how they complement each other is a debate that I think we definitely need to bring over into this day and age. And again, his words just prove timeless. Guy, do you have any thoughts on women's lib, or do you want to just continue over onto your greatest hit?
I think I'll leave that to the women on the panel, but
Smart, smart. Not like
all of
Buckley,
your
but smart.
yes, all of your first-hand expertise, I think, will make you much better poised to address that topic than me. But the maybe to take us in a slightly lighter direction, the column I went with. I mean, when I heard that we were going to do this, and when I learned that this is what we were going to open by talking about, there were I could have spent hours, days trawling over all of the columns and all of the essays that Bill wrote, all of the ones that I've read over the years, all of the ones that I've never read, all of the endless books that compiled his various works, compiled all of the notes and asides from NR, his syndicated column, the essays he wrote for other places. But I decided instead of doing that, it would probably be the best idea to go with the first essay that popped into my head. And the first one that popped into my head is an essay from 1986 that Bill wrote for the New York Times called I Am Lapidary but Not Heuristic When I Use Big Words, which is a defense of his distinctive and expansive vocabulary, which, of course, for everyone shooting him will know was a hallmark of Bill's career and one of the things that made Bill so endearing and such a captivating and effective public speaker. But there are many words Bill used on a regular basis that I don't understand and that have not quite wormed their way into my quotidian vocabulary. And I'm sure that's the case for many of us listening. Quite how he learned so many words and was able to deploy them so readily and so effectively, I'm really not sure. It's almost superhuman. But in the essay, he makes, as you would expect, a very lively and a very rigorous and humorous argument for why it isn't pretentious to use highfalutin words that the average reader might not be familiar with. And I think toward the end of the essay, I think he hits on a key point that is true of other writers who do this too, people like George Will, John Updike, Tom Wolfe, who also weren't afraid to go somewhat out there in the way they wrote their essays and didn't think it was right to talk down to their readers. The extract that stood out to me, Bill writes, the reader, in reference to reading a column, has the usual choices when he comes across a word he doesn't understand. He can ignore the word, attempt from the context to divine its meaning precisely or roughly, or he can look it up. Are these alternatives to an imposition? Yes, if the newspaper's feature that day is on how to treat a rattlesnake bite. You would not instruct the reader to fight the poison at outrance. By which I think what he was getting at is, I think that what Bill understood, and I think what made him so effective, is he wanted to appeal to a more intellectually upscale kind of readership. And he also wanted to compel people who were perhaps not the most, who were coming to his work and discovering his work and weren't the most knowledgeable about politics ahead of time, to learn more about it and to embrace it without talking down to them, without patronizing them. And I think that was what made a lot of his work so compelling, and you can see it displayed quite clearly in that wonderful piece.
Definitely. One of the hallmarks of like journalism school or any sort of writing class that you take is you're taught to, especially when you're writing news articles, write for an eighth grade audience. And one of the things that I love about National Review, and I'm sure Guy and Kamden would say the same thing, and Nicholas, but is that National Review, like you said, it doesn't talk down to its readers. It assumes that like the reader, if they're thinking about ideologically heavy battles or words or ideas, that they're willing to elevate themselves as well. And I've learned so much from just this style. But one of the things, speaking about relevance and how Buckley is sort of endlessly relevant no matter what generation you're a part of, my favorite essay, and I don't know if it's one that's widely populated anymore, but it's a 1970 essay about the Cosmopolitan magazine, about Cosmo. It's titled "You Are the More Cupcakeable for Being a Cosmopolitan Girl." And it's essentially Buckley's rebuke after having read dozens of issues of Cosmo, of the morally repugnant behavior that Cosmo not only like populated but elevated in its pages. So things having to do with, the sexual revolution and how women are free to be adulterous, everything like that. So I just want to read a few lines because one of the other things Bill does, not only does he use big words, but he uses other people's words against them so effectively. It's not really in a condescending manner. It was just always humorous and very witty. So I'm going to read a little bit from this. And I think some of these archives are available online. I think you can find the Cosmo online, but if not, essays of Bill's are published on like Amazon Books. You can buy them online for pretty cheap. So there you go. But I'm just going to read a couple paragraphs here. Mind you, the new Cosmo, the other great publishing success of the decade, along with Playboy, the greatest coincidence since Love Begot Screw, is not without a sense of morality, provided you lean hard on the metaphorical uses of the word. For one thing, there is the high up management that keeps an eye on it. It is a Hearst magazine. One time, Helen Gurley Brown, who is the publisher, founder of Cosmo, asked the girls at the office to recount in unsigned memos whether their men had any extraordinary uses for their, sorry to go back to them again, and I'm sorry for the raunchiness here, but any extraordinary uses for their breasts. One girl, Helen called her a B word, which is the opposite of a cosmopolitan girl, sent a copy of the memo anonymously to Women's Wear Daily, which printed it, and right away there was a commotion upstairs because you see, not all the Hearst management are cosmopolitan girls. Just hilarious, a hilarious rebuke. And then another one, he speaks about a Cosmo essay that was published that it essentially, like I said, makes the case for adultery. And Bill writes, "You do understand. It's your duty, madam, not to go to bed with anybody unless you want to. Who says the cosmopolitan girl is without a sense of restraint? Of course, things can go wrong. For instance, there was the girl who was raped. She naturally wrote an article called 'I Was Raped.' The reader's sympathy quickens as she recounts the experience and the skepticism with which her story was treated by the police and later at the clinic. But then the sun begins to shine as you realize that the cosmopolitan girl is never really taken altogether by surprise. In the midst of her despair, she recalls, 'Thank God I was taking birth control pills.' So just hilarious, especially given the fact that Teen Vogue, which is something I used to read as a teenager, Teen Vogue just shuddered because of its just insane articles that it would publish, both about sex, about about politics, about everything of the sort. So it's kind of fun to read the Cosmo essay, especially in light of the shuttering of another terrible women's magazine like Teen Vogue. But I kind of also want to ask, this is a question we got, this is a question that we as young people get kind of frequently at NR, but what attracted you to National Review? Many of our critics say that we're outdated, but clearly looking at your young, fresh faces, that can't be true. So let's start with Guy. What about you?
I had I've been reading National Review for really the past decade. I mean, that was when I first came in contact with it. I grew up in England. I was in what would equate to my senior year of high school at the time, going into September, it would have been September, October 2015, when, of course, the presidential election that year was beginning apace. And that was certainly an auspicious time to be getting interested in American politics. But as I started to pay attention, I didn't really know very much at all about politics at the time. I couldn't even have really defined the difference between right and left. But I started paying attention to the debates. I started paying attention to uh, the Republican agenda versus the Democratic agenda. And in searching for analysis of that and intelligent and sophisticated analysis of the election and of the debates between the parties online, I somehow or another stumbled across National Review. And as I started to read it, I not only found that I was naturally very interested in all of it, but also that it naturally and intuitively, all of the arguments being put forward by the writers there and the overall philosophy and ideology being conveyed by the writers there intuitively made sense to me. And I recognized it as just correct. It seemed like exactly what I had always been something I had always been waiting to discover and primed to discover. And then as I kept reading it more and more and getting to know more and more about its history, and I discovered Bill and everything he created and everything he stood for and achieved, I think what's unique about National Review and what's unique about Bill and what will ensure that both the institution and the man that animated it continue to draw in and continue to resonate with young people is that both Bill understood, and this is still very much embodied in the magazine, that the best thing about conservatism, as opposed to progressivism, is that it's just so much fun to be a part of. There's no rigidity to it. Conservatism isn't about dogma, it is dogmatic devotion to progress, slavish devotion to sort of rigid ideals that we want to see achieved, utopianism. Conservatism is all about intellectual ferment. It's all about intellectual diversity. It's all about intimacy and debate. It's all about key American principles and standing up for what makes America so much fun to be a part of and what makes this country so magnificent. And naturally, I think everything that stems from a healthy and robust conservative movement as a consequence of that is a lot of fun to be a part of as well. And I think the writers at National Review continue every day in Buckley's shadow to contribute to that and to keep those debates and that sense of fun and good humor alive and enthralling for people.
There's nothing I love more than when Guy talks about how great America is because he's obviously not from here. And every time I'm saying, so true. That's so true. There's something about this country that really got you. But Kamden, how about you? What attracted you to NR?
I think, first of all, it is just such a natural impulse to want to be a part of something bigger than yourself. And in conservative media and conservative journalism, I feel like there's no greater example of that than National Review. Obviously, we just celebrated our 70th anniversary. And as we said at the beginning of this webinar, today is Buckley's 100th birthday. And it is just, like I said, such an honor to be a part of an institution like National Review with ideas and thoughts that are just so enduring and so relevant, even today in 2025 as we approach 2026. And as a graduate of Hillsdale College, as you also are, Haley, that's a place also that teaches a lot about enduring ideas and ideas that are rooted in principle. And I just think Buckley is such a wonderful example of that. And we learned so much about Buckley in our journalism program there. And so that was just especially in college, was just something where I was like, wow, National Review's a place that I would want to be. And then, obviously all of our commentary is so wonderful, and Guy spoke to that. But as someone who does a lot of news writing for NR, I think that's something that I always admired about National Review so much is the way we report the news. It obviously we cover conservative issues and issues that conservatives care about, but we do so in a very measured way and in a way that Buckley would be very proud of, highlighting what matters and what conservative people want to read about the news that's happening. But yeah, like I said, doing so in a way that's very appropriate and honorable. And so that's just been an absolute pleasure to be a part of. And yeah, the reason why I'm thrilled to be here and why other young people should be really excited about National Review.
Yeah, and you heard it here first. Hillsdale College's journalism department might be the only one that doesn't teach you like about climate advocacy and instead has you read Bill Buckley. So send your kids to Hillsdale or go there yourself, whichever you want to do. But that's a really good point that you make, Kamden, that we all want to be part of something bigger than ourselves, especially in the conservative movement. And I feel like at a time when young people are kind of contemplating what exactly that means, being at a place like National Review, where we have such a strong heritage and founder who still lives on through our mission, has been really important to probably all of us. You mentioned going to Hillsdale. I'm a 2023 graduate, like you said. And something that I didn't know, but I found out as I was accepting a job at National Review, was that Bill Buckley was on the selection committee to choose our beloved president, Dr. Larry Arnn. So there's just like Bill Buckley shows up in your history, if you are a conservative. National Review was recently at the Young America's Foundation, which Bill helped start. Obviously, the Sharon Statement we all know. But Bill helped start at National Review, was recently at the booth. And I have to say, one of the things that we were somewhat surprised about is how few students had intimate knowledge with maybe Bill, the legacy he left at YAF. And I think to us Gen Z conservatives at National Review, that can be a little sad, but it's a discussion, an ever-going discussion on National Review's side of how to bring new young people into the fold. So I'd love to get your thoughts on exactly, what we can do to make the case for Buckley's conservative principles and how National Review is currently doing it in the somewhat divided Gen Z conservative space. Let's throw it to who first? Who wants to take it?
I mean, I think part of the issue with Bill is that even though he wrote so many books, as opposed to someone, I had an angry objectivist make this point to me once before, but I don't think it's necessarily wrong. Bill never really wrote one particular book that was really transcendent and that really infiltrated popular culture
Yeah.
and the American imagination quite sufficiently enough to have his legacy and it continue over and to have him be noticed as a household name
He
in
never
that
like
way.
had his magnum opus, right? Yeah, yeah.
In,
That's the critique.
yes, in the same way that like an Atlas Shrugged, which everyone obviously
Right.
knows the name of, regardless of what you feel about the content. There are plenty of notable books. Garden Man at Yale, A Making of a Mayor, Up from Liberalism, but most of them are all sort of their time in some way, or a little bit, especially Garden Man at Yale. It's quite a juvenile book. Up from Liberalism is very of its time. And Making of a Mayor, even though it's brilliant, is also obviously all about a mayoral campaign. So I think the way to keep, in terms of keeping Buckley alive and keeping Buckley relevant for young people and having them discover him, I think the principles that Buckley stood for and the principles that he championed are are, and always will be relevant because Buckley stood for the central insights of conservatism, and the central insights of conservatism are correct. That human nature is immutable, that you can't spend money that you don't have, that America is the greatest country on earth. That might be a little editorializing on my part, but I don't think it's an exaggeration.
Again, we'll accept it from you, but
And I think Bill Bill was successful in putting these ideas forward and in making them palatable to people because he engaged with them and he espoused them in a very lively, a very humorous, and a very cheerful way that made him enticing to people. He wasn't aggressive. He wasn't hostile. He wasn't intent on destroying his opponents or scoring cheap victories over them. He earnestly wanted to engage with people and he earnestly wanted to persuade people to the conservative side. But he also understood that he needed to engage with the battle for ideas on every front that was available to him, whether it was in print, on radio, speeches, campus tours, television. And now I think the fronts in the battle for ideas have changed somewhat. Television is less relevant now than YouTube is now, or than other mediums on the internet are now for getting our ideas across. So I think the conservatives who still for Buckley conservatives, for people who still believe in Buckleyite conservatism and the Buckleyite consensus, the way to engage and the way to keep it thriving is to use the new mediums that are available to us to put forward those old principles and those ideas that are still valid in a new and engaging way that will captivate young people while still sticking to the substance behind those principles, which is old wisdom that is still and will always be correct.
And as you mentioned, Bill did that so beautifully with his show Firing Line. When he brought a new medium to people's attention, he knew that that's the space he needed to go to. National Review has realized somewhat of the same with social media, which, as a conservative people, we are all a little bit loath to serious change, and especially being, on Instagram and scrolling through very short form videos. Like it's been proven that that's not the best for attention span, but that's where the young people are, and that's where you need to go meet them with the ideas that, again, we think very important and potent. So I would love to get your guys' thoughts on how Firing Line, something as intellectually robust as a debate that Buckley would have on Firing Line, can be translated into short form content that's easily digestible. Kamden, I know you've been doing a lot of our videos on this front for, YouTube, social media. So give us your thoughts on this.
Yeah, that's a great question, Haley. One of the things that I admire most about Firing Line, besides, as you said, like the deeply intellectual conversations that Buckley was having with his guests, is that oftentimes he was having a conversation with a guest that he disagreed with, or someone who maybe had a different point of view than him. And I feel like, unfortunately, that's just something we've really lost, especially in these past couple years. We've seen a major uptick in political violence. Polls are saying that, voters aren't concerned if people are turning to violence to handle their disagreements. And that's there's always been political violence, but we've just seen a very saturated amount of it recently. And Buckley was able to, through Firing Line, talk to these people, have, calm, coherent conversations about or from opposite sides of the spectrum on one issue. One that specifically comes to mind, I was watching it earlier today, was he was speaking with Norman Mailer, who was a journalist, and he was unabashedly, a leftist. This was in the late 60s when he was having this conversation, and they're talking about communism, and just they're going back and forth, and Mailer says, "Oh, I think actually that Democrats are harder on communists and they fight harder like in war on communists than Republicans do, because they always have to prove that they're not communists, and Republicans are able to make peace with communists." And Buckley, disagreed with that assertion, but was able to. And Haley, you kind of spoke about it earlier. He's great about using other people's words to sort of disarm them. He looks at Norman Mailer and he says, "Well, you support Castro. Like, can you explain that, and explain how you are so against communism, but you can support someone like that?" And they actually had a really calm conversation. Were able to see each other's sides. Buckley at times like, "Hey, I see what you're saying." Mailer the same thing. And there's not much of a place for that right now in political discourse, and I think that would be a really great thing to try to get back to if we can, just to sort of lessen the temperature on like in political discourse. And as you said, Haley, doing it online is a great place to do it. Buckley pioneered that with Firing Line. So many other people are doing that today online, and it's of the time. It's what people are doing. It's sometimes frustrating that people aren't reading 1,000-word articles, but those videos are what are getting the points across. And so if we're able to do that, I think that'd be a great way to not only get people excited about National Review, but get people to further understand why we believe what we believe, why Buckley believed what he believed, and do so in a format that people are excited about in 2025.
Guy, any thoughts here?
Um, Not much that I can add, no, except all of that I think is pretty spot on. I think on the Firing Line point, if you watch a lot of those old Firing Line episodes, I think the most captivating ones are the ones in which Buckley was able to sort of set up who he was sparring with and let them expose the holes in their own arguments by virtue of his own charm and his own acuity. A great one is the debate with George Wallace from 1968. There's a great debate with I may get her full name wrong. I think it was Magdalene Murray O'Hair, who was the head of the American Atheists. I think that's from the early 70s, where they talk about religious freedom and the role of and what's covered by the First Amendment and the role of religion in public life. If you watch both of those debates, you see Bill at his most adept in terms of verbal nimbleness and intellectual, sort of multidimensional intellectual thinking, how he was able to stay several steps ahead of his opponent, but also how he was able to really win the crowd that was that was present for every taping over his side through through his humor, through his wit, through his elegance, through his charisma, through his charm. And I think all of those ingredients are things that can easily be forgotten among conservatives today, particularly in the somewhat tumultuous political moment we're living through now, and particularly in an online media ecosystem that very much rewards punchy content and hot takes and clicks and aggression and so on. I think it's key to remember that being it's key to remember that for Bill, again, his charm and his humor and his elegance were often what won the day. And if we stray away from that, I don't think it's going to bode well for the conservative movement. I think if we continue in the mold, I think what's going to help conservatives ensure that conservatives' ideas continue to win and continue to resonate with young people is if we continue to adhere to the template of happy warriors that Bill championed and that worked so successfully for him over the decades.
Yeah, absolutely. And I kind of want to touch on, and again, please drop your questions or comments in the chat, and we'll sort of filter through them in about 5, 10 minutes here or so. But one of the things, especially as Gen Z conservatives, I think a lot of us feel, and can correct me if I'm wrong here, but is that a few of the debates that Buckley had are now being brought back up again, a sort of Buchanan versus Buckley, a sort of purging the right of anti-Semites. And you can say the two are different, but it's being brought up by again, especially because among the right, especially young men on the right and just young conservatives on the right, there's definitely an uptick in people who seriously listen to conservative, if you call them that, just influencers like Candace Owens, like Nick Fuentes, even like Tucker Carlson. And for us, as sort of Buckley-minded young conservatives, we see those groups as a little bit concerning. But Guy, on your point, I think that a lot of the popular podcasts among the young right now, a lot of the popular podcasts don't do what you say they do, which is what we think they should do, right? Is attack debate and ideas with a sort of elegance and composure and again, like we've mentioned before, intellectual rigor. And right now, what we're seeing is a lot of attacks, a lot of conspiracy theories, which there's nothing new under the sun. Buckley confronted this as well. He just did a much better job at disarming people. But I want to ask you guys, how do you think that we can make the case to young conservatives in Buckley's spirit, especially at a time when young conservatives are being attacked by voices who are, shall we say, not quite as diplomatic as we would hope they would be? Start with Guy, and then go to
Well,
Kamden.
I mean, to the backdrop of that question, I think the rise of people like Owens and Fuentes and this sort of paranoid thinking among young people, I think it's palatable to young people and young men in particular, because I think there are a lot of young men in this country who are in very vulnerable positions and who are very insecure and sort of feel very much adrift in the world that we live in, which is wealthy, self-sufficient, but all and wonderful and hyper-connected, wonderful in so many ways, but as a byproduct of those things, it's also atomized. This is a climate where we have Netflix piped to our homes. We can order food and products directly to our doors. We can talk to people around the world within a few button taps online anytime we please. And all of those things have a great deal of utility if used correctly. But I think the trade-off of that has been there are a lot of people who, particularly in recent years, and I think the pandemic very much accelerated it, have fallen in to these sort of bizarre online rabbit holes, but they are finding it very difficult to claw their way out of, and but it's very difficult to pull them out of, and that they see it as they would prefer to simply wallow there and stay stuck there than try to find their way out. I think that's a cultural problem, and the cultural fix to that, it is a bigger question that we can't really get into at this panel, but it will take a lot of healing of institutions, a focus on the family unit, a focus on improving education, all sorts of things that could be done. Putting all of that to one side and focusing more on how conservatives should engage on top of that, I think you bring up uh, the division between Buckley and Buchanan, Haley, and it is a division and it is a debate that's still very active now and that we still see playing out now very much in real time. I think it's important to remember that what Buckley stood for and what Buckley understood, and which I think is the essence of American conservatism, rightly understood, is that being conservative in the American sense, is not the same as being right wing, quote unquote. Conservatism isn't synonymous with a sort of vulgar populism. And I think much of Buckley's thinking stemmed from the fact that as a young man growing up, he saw the dangers of what could happen in particularly in foreign countries, watching from abroad, when crowds and voters are riled up and manipulated and flattered by demagogues. It can lead to very bad things, and there's nothing very conservative about mob thinking and violence and herd mentality. And additionally to that point, what Bill also understood and what he stood for is that conservatism is not about sort of ethnic nationalism, ugly us versus them sort of thinking. It's about standing up for the American idea of America as a creedal nation, which people can be a part of this by subscribing to that creed, subscribing to the key propositions that animated this country and that founded this country and that make this country unique. And conservatism is about standing up for the principles of small government, of liberty, and of conserving a liberal political order that's premised on ideas of an open society, a tolerant society, limited government, a law-abiding society in which everyone has the best, which is the ideal society that can exist and that can enable people to flourish and live the lives they want to live. I think there are a lot of young people who are at the age where they're very ambitious, they have big dreams and they have those goals and those desires and those thoughts about what they'd like to do with their lives, but they feel left behind or locked out or trapped in some way. And I think we have to, what the best way of doing it is, it will obviously involve a lot of what we've talked about already, engaging more in the online space, going about it in the right way. But I think we have to engage with those people who feel lost, who seem adrift, and we have to show them that this way of thinking and this conception of American conservatism and of the American Republic and what it's supposed to stand for is the real antidote for this malaise that's gripped people, and not the sort of tribalism and herd-like ugly populism that we've seen become resurgent in recent years.
That's right. The tagline for some of the most popular right-wing, influencers or podcasters right now, or even, YouTubers, is "I'm just asking questions," right? We see this with Tucker, we see this with Candace, we see this with all of them. And the problem, as you mentioned, is when you're just asking questions, you're not actually often saying anything. So you can ask as many questions as you want. You can talk about conspiracy theories all day. You can ask, "Oh, is Mossad trying to kill me tomorrow?" Which is like what Candace Owens is going on about these days now. But if you're just asking questions, you're not actually standing up for the principles you say you support. Kamden, any thoughts on this?
Yeah, first and foremost, I think Guy covered that really well, and Haley, you did as well. In general, young people I would say for a long time have felt, disenfranchised by the establishment, and if, for lack of a better way to say it, like sensationalism sells, and people who fall more on like the left end of the spectrum, those papers and publications and politicians do really great with, acting like the world's going to end and you need to vote for me to fix this and fix that. And I mean, Mom Donnie's a great example. a socialist gets elected in New York because people are so desperate. And there's then obviously a sect of, young people who are on the right and they aren't susceptible to left-wing ideology or thought processes, but they don't feel like anything's, being done to help them. And Guy, you spoke to that really, really well. And I think even recently, like the 50-year mortgage conversation, like young in student loans, people are really frustrated about a lot of those things. And even if people like Candace and Tucker aren't giving concrete, solutions to those problems, they're making those people feel seen because they're frankly just, saying outrageous things. And that's maybe more that the young people feel like is being done than, by these, as amazing as Buckley's principles are, maybe they're just not relating to them because they're not seeing how they're playing out in their life day to day versus these other people in these spaces when they speak in ways that they do. So it's a difficult needle to thread for sure. But I think, as Guy said, as we just continue to push forward and try to engage in some of these spaces and fill some of these spaces with, National Review content and Buckley's principles and just principles that are core tenets to American conservatism. Hopefully it can take over some of those spots and people can find solace in those beliefs and principles. But until then, I think if you can step back and, think about it, it's understandable why people are leaning to some of those things, as discouraging as it may be for all of us and for supporters of the magazine.
Yeah. And I think we're gonna shift to Q&A now here, if that's all right. Nicholas, do you want to
Yeah.
Okay.
So I'm gonna start with one question we had from give me one second. I think this was Paul. Yes. And this goes to the discussion you just had. So one quick observation I think to keep in mind about Bill is he's not consistent about all these positions over the course of a long life. He has many different influences, and sometimes he sounds much more traditionalist than liberal or libertarian. And it sort of depends, right? So even in terms of his view of the founding, that kind of shifts back and forth over time, in part because early on he is very influenced by Wilmore Kendall, who's his teacher at Yale. And then he's more influenced by Harry Jaffa by the 1980s. So there's a shift here. I think we're going to share a video in the chat if anyone wants to look. We had a debate in September with Michael Brennan Doherty and ISI's Dan McCarthy about whether Bill's legacy is more conservative or libertarian. Charlie Cook is who moderated that debate. So I think that does an excellent job at getting at all of this stuff that, Bill's really complicated figure. So that's, I think, a great place to go. Paul's question was about sort of Bill being one more attached to timeless principles, which I think goes to this sort of complications in his legacy that our earlier debate got into. And that he didn't write a magnum opus, but he did have he had Firing Line, of course, but he also had On the Right, his syndicated column that ran for, I think, about 44 years, I believe. I would add to that one of the reasons that people still go back to, for instance, the book on the mayoral race is that, he does have this, 10-point program basically, but a lot of that looks rather prescient because some of the things that he actually pushed, in fact, became policy, or in the case of Uber, happened for a variety of other reasons. But in any case, it's that instead of a magnum opus, his magnum opus really is sort of whether or not you think it's the total collection of that syndicated column, Firing Line itself, and then all the other various articles and books that he wrote.
Does anyone want to take it?
I mean, I agree with that completely on the merits, but all of that, but certainly Bill's entire oeuvre in taken together absolutely constitutes a sort of intellectual magnum opus. I think in terms of I think the challenging thing, though, for from if memory serves, we got onto that subject because we were talking about how young people can discover Bill and why it might be more difficult for them in this day and age, and what the best way of keeping Bill relevant and keeping Bill's works alive in this day and age might be. I think it's trickier purely because Bill produced so much and it was all spread out across so many different mediums that there isn't really one particular universally recognized starting point that really penetrated the sort of cultural consciousness in the most in one particularly successful or universally recognized way. I think that makes it harder for people. And on the first principles point, I completely agree that the first principles that Bill championed are what we should prioritize in assessing his life and legacy. But I think that people come to for people who are getting interested in politics and for people who discover conservatism and are introduced to these things, they start with politics first and then work their way, oftentimes, at least in my experience, start with politics first and then work their way backward to the principles that are supposed to animate politics and that are supposed to undergird conservative philosophy. And if we can't expose them to a lot of the political successes and a lot of the political ideas that made Bill so influential and made Bill so consequential beforehand, it's going to be harder to steer them back from that toward the core conservative ideas and the core ideas about the American experiment and so on, that Bill, Western civilization and all of that, that Bill really dedicated his life to, and that everything rests upon.
Just a plug for what Nicholas has been working super tirelessly on, which is the Buckley Legacy Project. It's a project that we're doing in conjunction with the 100th anniversary of Bill's birth and also the 70th anniversary of the magazine. Nicholas has created a timeline with some references and also some archives to Bill's work, which especially going to Hillsdale College, we were very blessed to have access to the National Review archives. But because Bill's work was handed down to his estate, things are a bit murky. It's not like we have everything on the site all the time. So we've been working to digitalize everything. Nicholas has been. And so you will have, some more access to the archives if you check out the Buckley Legacy Project. If I can say that. That's correct,
No,
right?
no, thank you for that. Yeah, if you go to our website and we can put a link in for that too. You can see the timeline. There are some short articles there too, so you can see some of these things about kind of young Bill. I don't want to say young Bill, old Bill. That's not totally fair, but it's just sort of to get to all these portions of his legacy. The other thing being, we mentioned all these books he wrote. He also wrote 12 spy novels. So that is also on that website too. So
Which,
he, no,
some
if you
people like
sell,
him, some people don't. Some of his
well,
close
he
friends
sold
liked him,
millions of
some people
books.
didn't. But he
He,
sold millions of
he sold millions of books. He
Yeah,
won an award, and
they're
he even
fun.
turned the second book into a play. Um,
I didn't even know that. Wow.
it's on the timeline.
Maestro.
So there you go.
There you go. There you go.
So you can find all of that there. We'll put a link in. So let's move on to the next question. So we have Brooke who asks, thank you for hosting. I'm a college student, although he says he's too young to drive. So I'm trying to put that together. Is he saying he's 15, but he's in college? I'm guessing yes. He
Wow.
says, what would you recommend to someone like me to do to be more involved in National Review in the fusionist movement? Thank you. I would take part of that question to be as well. Perhaps if you guys want to think about this, what is fusionism today, or is that still it is it was in the 1960s? Is that still a coherent sort of set of ideas or big tent, if you will?
I'll just take the practical part of this question
Yeah.
and pass it on. But I mean, there are still very small pockets of like a huge fusionist movement here in DC. But if you're not in those circles, it can be a little difficult. Definitely connect with people online. Feel free to shoot us an email or a Twitter DM. I know I feel a little young saying that, but feel free to reach out to us and we're happy to connect you with some folks we know. But how to get more involved with National Review, and especially if you're like a conservative writer, certainly just pitch people. This is a really small space, and one of the great things about National Review and this fusionist movement altogether is that everyone here, as especially as speaking as a young person, everyone has been very willing to help. So please just reach out if you can and maybe, pitch an article or a book review or something like that. Conservative outlets are always a little bit starved for book reviews because we all love to read, but it's pretty hard to digest a text and then write it all down. So yeah, just start pitching stuff and please reach out to some of us online. Guy, you wanna?
Yeah, well, I mean, on the fusionism question, first of all, just on a philosophical level, I think fusionism rightly understood at its core is the philosophical formulation that freedom and virtue are inextricable from one another, and that this is the bedrock of Western civilization that flows throughout all of Western civilization right up until America in the present day. I think but that core premise has been muddied somewhat by a lot of the more practical debates about fusionism and the practical debates of trying to balance conservatives of a more libertarian persuasion with conservatives of a more traditionalist or socially minded persuasion in the movement over the years to keep it healthy and so on. You can get very deep into the weeds on it in a way that I don't think we're going to quite have time for on this call. But I think for someone who wants to learn, someone who is young and wants to learn more about it, that's the key thing that you should bear in mind, and you should work forward from there and try to learn more about it and be engaged with it by reading a lot of the core authors who promulgated it. Try to read Frank Meyer. Try to read some of the people who were who were still writing about the ideas today, like Don Devine has a great book called The Enduring Tension. I believe that's the correct title, which is all about what fusionism was supposed to mean before it became fully subsumed into political debates and practical politics and so on. And to that point, in terms of how, if you're a young person and you're interested in all of this and want to get involved with it, I mean, I went about it in quite an unusual way since I went to college and abroad and grew up abroad and everything. So I don't have I don't have too much first-hand knowledge about what it's like on American college campuses. But what I can tell you is that I created a lot of opportunities for myself purely because that I knew that this was what I wanted to be doing, and I knew that the conservative movement and National Review style conservatism was what I wanted to be involved with. And so when I was in school in England, I just took it upon myself to try out try writing op-eds for the school paper, try to find like-minded people who, even if they aren't exactly your same flavor of conservatism, who they try to find some conservatives who you can have arguments with, who you can maybe build something on campus with, try to build a publication, try to build a student group, try to host debates, try to create some sort of infrastructure or some sort of institutional framework, right, like that. And if you do that sort of thing and carve out those sort of opportunities for yourself, it will obviously help you sharpen your ideas and become much more knowledgeable and confident and effective in that sense. But it will also, you'll be surprised in terms of how many opportunities that can stem as a consequence of that and that can be created through that. So that's what I'd say.
Um, just going off of that, as I completely agree, with what Haley and Guy said, and on the practical side of that, it's like, yeah, write for your school paper, pitch to NR, pitch to other publications, because when you are able to build that portfolio, like that can help you potentially get an internship someday. So on a practical side, just write as much as possible, get published as much as possible. Also too, then, as like 100% read books from people that helped pioneer the movement, talk to people who you agree with. Also read books with people by people you disagree with, or talk to people you disagree with. That's a really great way to sharpen your thoughts and your own principles and decide what you believe in. If you don't understand why you disagree with something when you're speaking with someone, take that as an opportunity to go research why you disagree with it, because knowing the other side can be so helpful in deepening your understanding and your beliefs. But Haley and Guy covered that really, really well.
The comments made me think of somebody who's still at National Review, who 55 years ago, at the age of 15, pitched an article to National Review and was published. That's Rick Brockheiser,
Go read
who,
his book too, Right
yes,
Time, Right
yes, go
Place.
read
The
his
best
book, Right
book.
Time,
Yeah.
Right Place, and he talks. We will talk all about this, but he wrote a couple articles for National Review when he was in high school, and he ended up being, I believe, the youngest senior editor in the history of the institution at 22 or 23. But that's covered in the book. But it's in within the history of the magazine. So even at high school, that's a kind of a nice way of suggesting that Bill was open to all comers if the writing was good. In the case of Rick, he was quite the precocious talent. So it is 2:55. Haley, do we want to take one last question, or do you want to wrap from here with each of you saying something briefly before we come to the end?
I think we're free to wrap up. Yeah, I'll let
Okay,
Kamden and Guy say a quick
sure.
adieu. But yeah, just thank you all for tuning in. Again, it's like the greatest pleasure of, I'm sure, our lifetimes to be able to carry on any sense of Buckley's legacy that we can. I know we all strive to do better, but please reach out to us. Another great legacy here at National Review is that our readers are some of the most involved and personal readership in this business. We love hearing from you. And it warms our hearts too to know that you guys love National Review just as much as we do.
It's one of
Yeah.
Bill's last books. It's the notes and asides. That's all the readers collected into one, so you guys can look that up too.
Yeah, I would add again, thank you everyone. I can see plenty of people tuned in for this and stayed through the whole thing, which I'm very grateful for. Thank you all for that. And I would say too, just quickly, I noticed that someone in the Q&A tab asked a question about Sam Tannenhaus's biography, and the whoever sent the question in said they found it disappointing. I would say I agree, and if you want really the best biography that's been written about Bill and that may ever be written about Bill, you should read Al Felsenberg's A Man and His Presidents, especially in that also to the gentleman who asked the question about how to get more engaged with who's looking to get more engaged and to learn more about all of these things. Al's book is brilliant. It's accessible. It's clearly written. It isn't too long, and it does a very good job at covering all of the different facets of Bill's life and everything he wanted his legacy to be remembered for, much better than Tannenhaus's tome does.
I'll just echo what everyone said. Really, they wrapped it up beautifully, and just say that it's such an honor to work for National Review and be able to, just even speak on this panel today as a young person who gets to just play a part in extending Buckley's legacy and his mission. And yeah, it was a pleasure to be here today, and thanks everyone for coming.
And I will say, Guy, that Al Felsenberg, who's a member of the Buckley Legacy Project Advisory Committee, was yet another young person who met Bill, and it's in the book as well, just like with Rick. But he's an example of somebody who really looked up to Bill and met him as a young man, and then I think you see that graciousness and gratitude in the book itself, and that's one of the reasons it stands out. It's the same thing with John Coyne in Linda Bridges' book on Bill. So you can see how much his mentorship and his fondness for young people was reflected on these handful of books about his legacy for people who he really brought up at a very young age and had an influence over many decades. And I'm sorry, Larry Perlman had a book out this year as well. So that's the same theme. He met Bill at 19 as a classical pianist, and that changed his life. So I think those are the kinds of books. I think that's great for you to point that out, because those are exactly the kind of things I think we want to leave people thinking about and have them go look up, especially if they agree with us that Sam's book's ultimately disappointing in that regard. So with that, thank you everybody for taking your time out today to come celebrate Bill's 100th with us, and we hope to see you next time. Thank you.